You're listening to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Welcome to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. My name is Mark Barber, Director of Content at Criticaleye. And today we'll be looking at and gaining the viewpoints of the chairs and non-executive directors, exploring how they can work with the CEO and CFO to ensure sustainability is prioritised strategically while also responding and adapting to some of the short-term pressures which we know are out there. I'm delighted to have 2 guests with me today. So we have Serena Lang, who is chair of Trifast. She's an independent NED on the board of Henry Boot, where she also chairs the Responsible Business Committee, and she's a NED at Ainsco Crane Hire. Previously, Serena was chair of Alico, where she helped transform the business. Joining Serena, we have Sebastian Munden, chair of the NGO RAP, the Waste and Resources Action Programme. He is also chair of AdNet Zero, the advertising industry's global initiative to deliver net zero ways of working and promote more sustainable products and services. Previously, Sebastian was chief executive of Unilever UK and Ireland up until 2022. So welcome, Serena and Seb.
Thank you.
Hello.
Great to be here.
Okay, lovely to have you. So we're talking from our CEO retreat, where the tagline for that is leading transformation sustainably. Some quite meaty topics to get into, perhaps no easy answers. So we will angle this around the sort of sustainability lens, but I thought it might be interesting sort of set the scene, I think, from the sort of different perspectives that you have. And I said you sit on a portfolio of boards, don't you? Not just RAP, and Serena as well. Just to get a sense of the landscape at the moment. So, Serena, if I start with you, what are you prioritising on your boards at present in terms of that sort of strategic goals versus maybe some of the shorter term actions that you need to take given sort of economic and I guess even geopolitical pressures that companies are under?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, the economic and the geopolitical issues that we've seen have meant that all businesses have had no choice but to really hunker down and look at, you know, what are their business models? Are they organised in the right way? Just in order to ensure that they are performing today and that they're able to perform into the future. So on my boards, you know, it's therefore very much about working really closely with the CEOs and the leadership teams to help them have space to talk about, you know, how are we ensuring we're sustainable for the future? How are we ensuring that we're doing the right things by our people? And they are looking at all of this, but of course keep being driven back down into, you know, how are we performing today and what those immediate actions are.
What would be an example of some of the questions that you're asking then of maybe the leadership team or execs?
Well, I suppose it's very difficult for people to ask about things that they don't know they haven't asked about. So I'm sure this is a perennial experience of all kind of NED and trustees working with the exec teams, which is, you know, how do you surface the things that may be new or have not been encountered before in a way that's kind of supportive and useful. And so I think those are the kind of questions that can help. You know, what are we missing here? What have we not seen? And what have we not spoken about that maybe we should have done? I think these kind of questions based in a very open and kind of trusting relationship between NEDs and trustees on the one hand and the exec on the other, are can be game changing, and can lead to profound conversations that are really, really useful.
Okay, and there's an element of actually refreshing the people maybe around the table as well.
Well, good governance, and particularly in the NGO sector, where our trustees are magnificent. They do it for the cause. We don't pay trustees.
Yeah.
We couldn't possibly afford to do that. And so really having good term management and being clear what the terms are. And, we hope always to get 2 terms out of our trustees at RAP, but we don't always. And then it's always sad to say goodbye to colleagues, but it's also an opportunity to bring a different and fresh perspective on the organisation.
At Henry Boot, we had all our non-executives had all started at exactly the same time. So our chair did a good job of early on going, well, we need to get at least one of us not swapped out, but new, to get to understand the board quickly before we come to the end of our 9-year term. So that was me joining a couple of years ago. We had another new non-exec join. It certainly does help in terms of bringing in that new perspective. And it's like any organisation, isn't it? What you need to do is you need that organisational and board memory together with the new, fresh ideas. And I think in the volatile world we're working in, for me as chair, the key is always making sure that you're absolutely critical in looking at what are the skills that you need and have we actually got them? Because you might have some really great people on the board, but you might have a big missing.
No, as you're saying that, I was thinking that there's also been a tendency at the moment for some boards to then try and drop in maybe a NED that has a specific area of expertise, and then speaking to chairs around that. I know quite a few of them have pushed back on that idea and saying that then you're actually just siloing knowledge. Yes. You need to take collective responsibility. I don't know whether that's something you've got any thoughts around.
And I'll take an example in Trifast. So I have a visible gap in really in-depth knowledge of cyber. But do I want someone sitting on the board with in-depth cyber knowledge, or who might have historically had that? Not necessarily. But am I convinced cyber's one of our biggest risks? Yes. So what I want to know is that we are utilising really good, solid external resource to give us input, and that we've got somebody internally who's all over it like a rash, which I now know we have. But that is a good example. I think sustainability, Mark's slightly different, because I think sustainability is one of those things where certainly, with the exception of very large companies, a lot of organisations don't have bench strengths within them. No,
they don't.
And therefore you really do need somebody that understands that and how they can ask the right questions. Otherwise, you could end up
knowing when to ask the questions.
And knowing when to ask the questions, yes. So I do feel on that side, I think that's a really important one to have on.
Seb.
Yeah, and I think, for a RAP, we would want our trustees to be, multifaceted, exactly as Serena's saying. You've got to have multiple kind of lenses in each trustee. And yes, we have looked for specific backgrounds, but actually everyone that's come forward, brings so much more. So I think it's a good balance to make sure that if you do need some expertise that you really want to support and sustain the exec with, that people come with everything else as well.
Yeah, okay. There's a question here around how challenging has it been to work with leadership teams and remain a focus on those priorities given the uncertainty. For me, that always feels like that's the role of the board. There's nothing new in that. Is there any element of additional complexity that you're seeing at the moment in terms of that relationship between the chair and NEDs and the executive team? And I guess this gets into elements of how are you balancing the short versus long-term pace, not overloading the team. I'm sort of interested to get maybe Serena.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, because how challenging, for me, it's an absolute delight. You know, I love working with the executive team.
Yeah, it's the job, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. And, you know, if you can create an environment where they feel safe to really bring everything up that is on their minds, and ensure that you've got a team that is also open and listening, then you're on a win-win, aren't you? So it is about your approach, your colleagues' approach, you know, how board meetings go, that they come away feeling not exhausted but energised, whilst, of course, being really, really challenging where it's required, and knowing that they're doing that, sitting side by side with you, and we're on this journey together, and it's not you know, it shouldn't be two sides. You are there all with the same objectives. So, you know, I think I love it. I think it's so tough at the moment for exec teams, CEOs and CFOs. They're under so much pressure, and they never know where something's going to come from. I try very much on my boards, often fail to not have the exec team come out with yet another set of processes to put in place or do. I'd like to say I achieved that. That I don't, but at least it's a focus. You know, it's not come in, be grilled, give the board what they want to hear, leave, and we miss something. It's really about encouraging.
I appreciate it's always a work in progress, and it'll vary depending on the context of the business. But do you have a view of how long, when you go in as a chair, it can take to build that consensus? Because once you get that trust, it's very powerful. But I don't know whether you've got any thoughts around sort of when you're going in, sort of whether you sort of think this is going to take 6 months, a year. I'm just curious.
Getting to know the individuals and letting them get to know you on a personal scale is pretty important. And making sure that, you know, they know that you've got their back, absolutely rigorous around ensuring that the board is performing its duties. You know, interestingly enough for me as a NED, and it doesn't matter whether one's a chair or a non-executive or a trustee, but, you know, in a listed business, you know, you're going to be voted on predominantly every year, but you'll assume you're going to be staying there 9 years. Often that's going to be longer than the executive.
Yeah.
So you want to know that, you know, out there that business is going to be as successful as it is today. And I think there is a risk. That's why I think the term works, as people and chairs, NEDs, trustees do need to move on and move off, because as it gets closer to that term, you're losing that longer term focus.
Yes. Okay.
And I think it's really important that the kind of the short term, long term sort of prioritization in terms of activities, priorities is a conversation. I think it'd be a mistake to feel that, you know, the exec do the short term and the board do the long term. I think that's a big error. I think one of the things that boards can really help with is reassurance on the short term. Are the exec team focusing on the right things in the short term? You know, maybe things that aren't quite so important short term, and how does that then become manageable when you think about either transformation programs or building opportunities for the longer term. So I think that conversation really matters, and I think you can get to openness and that kind of level of collegiality that you need quite quickly. Like, there's a lot of space in that conversation for real frankness, but done in a very supportive way, and that's very needed in that situation. So it can happen when you work on it, and creating that environment I think is really important, and both the CEO and the chair can set the tone very quickly, and if that's done consciously, it can accelerate the performance of the board and accelerate the relationship between the exec and the NEDs or the trustees. But it can also do the opposite. So I think being very thoughtful and conscious of the precedents that are being set in early conversations is really important.
Yeah, because it really sets the tone.
It really sets the tone, but also it programs people in two ways, which is, well, I won't do that again. You can get that reaction. So particularly when people offer above and beyond what they're being, literally asked to do, which leads the conversation into a very insightful place. I think
what do you mean by that? Like, you can maybe get like a culture of fear within the...
Well, I mean, if you encourage that and the conversation is productive, people will do it again. Because they said that was a useful conversation. It built beyond the obvious and it built beyond the trite and got into a place where we really explored something more deeply. Or conversely, that can be shut down because one of the things that I try to never say is, well, I'm very conscious of time now, because that can be the killer to what could be the most useful exploration about the organisation and its future. And in the end, you can give a little time here, you can take a little time here, you can have a conversation outside the room, but closing things down at the point when they're about to get interesting is, I think, just about the worst thing you can do as a chair. And you can always say, look, we're going to take item 12 off the agenda this time. We'll bring it back, because where we are now is a growth space for this organisation. We're all learning something. We're putting things together in a different way, and that's a kind of exciting moment where everyone leaves the room knowing something more about the organisation and having a more shared, deep understanding of how it's going to progress and flourish in the future.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Seb, because the other thing for me, I always say to the executive teams, when you come to the board, you should expect to come out with more knowledge than you went in. You should be looking for that input and gain from the people that are in the room. It's not a one-sided.
Yeah, items for information are the death of board meetings. And frankly, unless it's vital information, it should be banned, because people can read it in advance. That's great. Now they know, done. But items for discussion, input, are the lifeblood of great governance. Of course, there's going to be decisions. Of course, there are, and they have to be made and they have to be properly recorded. But it's for me, it's items for input, items for kind of growth and exploration.
It's that kind of pie chart, isn't it? I guess between what governance, performance, strategy, and then trying to work out where the board needs to be around that. Okay. Who would be a CEO at the moment, given everything that's on their plate? Seb, you were a CEO at Unilever for UK and Ireland. Just wondered, like, in terms of when you look at everything that's on the plate of CEOs at the moment, in many organisations are dealing with the huge implications of the cost of capital. It can be challenging whether you're in private equity or publicly listed with shareholders. Just curious whether you've got, and also the whole issue around the workforce and how you're thinking about skills and culture. Sort of curious around sort of who would be CEO today.
Well, I think people who do it have a way of being which is both kind of insightful and thoughtful, and kind of the ability to kind of overview and see potential and opportunity, and then be able to get right down and make it happen through mobilizing and engaging people's emotions and intellect, and I think the circumstances change, but those enduring qualities persist, and it's the people who can articulate it and do it, and it's that rare combination of the attention to the right detail, but the big picture of where it's all going, and I think it is tough, particularly for those leading listed companies. The kind of pressures around ideas about how an organisation is successful and returns to shareholders, and that's why I think we talk a lot about the multi-stakeholder model. I'm a passionate believer in the multi-stakeholder model because I think it delivers better for shareholders and all the other stakeholders.
Why?
Because a business which becomes tunnel focused on only the shareholder actually starts to fail in understanding its customers, in understanding its suppliers, in understanding the environment and the world around it. I mean, I can't understand how any decent strategy process would not kind of take into account the needs and changes of all the stakeholders just to be successful. And, you know, all the strategy that I've ever been involved in over the last 30 years have always started with an understanding of, you know, the world around us.
What's your sense, and I appreciate this is a big question, I think from what you're saying, and I agree as well, that awareness and sense of accountability through a multi-stakeholder model is right. Do you think that's the way we're going with companies, or are you seeing companies shrink away from
Well, I think where it becomes unstuck is, you know, and where that becomes some kind of given reason for underperformance somewhere. That can't be wise. You know, there are probably other reasons for underperformance. But it cannot, I just don't believe it can be true that if you're diligently scanning your competitors, your suppliers, your customers, your employees, etc., government, society,
Yep.
If you're diligently scanning those, it cannot be the reason for underperformance. But I think what it should be doing is informing the products and services that are being offered to customers, the policies of the business on procurement and supply, and energy, etc., and actually, you know, they should be helping performance. They should be helping, you know, cost consciousness, margin. It should all work together.
You're aware as a business of these sort of multiple signals going on, and you're sort of attuned to.
I think it's, you know, it's lazy thinking that somehow, you know, this approach to strategy and delivery is somehow, in and of itself, a cause for underperformance.
Okay. Serena, some big questions there.
Yeah, and I think there was some research done quite some years ago that highlighted if you have got a happy employee base, you've got a winning model, because happy employees have got everything that they need to be happy in their work, which usually means you've got a good product or service, so there's a good offering. They're delivering it to customers in a way that means the customers are getting what they need. And if you've got those two pieces, then, you know, you should be a profitable business, and, you know, so you've got happy shareholders. So I always work on the premise that you've got to focus on all the areas. I think, and even when I started with Trifast, I said to shareholders, you know, we're going to be focusing on these other two, not because we're not here to deliver shareholder value. We absolutely are. But shareholder value, by talking just about what we're doing for shareholders, doesn't create value. The difficulty, though, and the complexity, is even if you take your employee base, for the first time ever, we've got 5 generations in the workplace. And so your employee base isn't homogenous. You know, I mean, it never was, don't get me wrong, but it's now really quite complicated. And as we look at you know, what we're doing on equity, you know, we've gone from it. I'm sort of, oh, have we or haven't we? But you know, we're trying to go from equality to equity. So, you know, we've got multifaceted employee bases. I think just looking after those and understanding those needs is complex. Your customer needs are very complex. You know, consumers will be looking for certain things in certain products. Doesn't mean they're willing to pay for it. You know, and you know, you might have employees that want to really focus on sustainability. I mean, at Henry Boot, we absolutely have a lot of brilliant recruitment comes to us because of our responsible business approach. You know, so we're not having to advertise now. People want to come and work for us. But you look at, you know, what Unilever did in terms of, you know, some really pretty strong groundbreaking stuff. they got backlash from shareholders. You look,
they've had to roll back, haven't they?
Yeah, I worked for BP historically, was really proud after, quite a few turbulent years. I felt was really proud when they launched their new strategy. Well, it didn't go down very well with their shareholder base, and they've had to roll back.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the important thing for me in terms of shareholders is then, all stakeholders, is communication, and the messaging is different for each. The other interesting thing I think on stakeholders is, as we move forward and we talk about how do we collectively look at what we're going to do on climate change, some of our competition's going to become partners. And that is going to be a really interesting dynamic as we start to work out how that works. How do you work with your competition on things that aren't, they're not a competitive advantage? An example that I asked the team at Trifast to look at this week is on CBAM. So this is the carbon tax. For some reason, heaven knows why, fasteners have been included in this. And there's a whole plethora of work that our team have got to do. And I said, no, you should not be looking at this in and of itself. And they said, no, don't worry, we're not. But, which was great to hear, but we have to collaborate across the whole industry to find a solution as to how we do that, because there's no added value in it, but it is essential for the future.
Okay. But I think the way sustainability targets have been set has changed. First generation of sustainability targets were set, as a pace setter very much. I think in many places they were set in terms of what they ought to be. I think the second generation of sustainability targets are now based in many cases on practical experience. So they're now based around what can be done. In other words, the first set of targets may never have been hittable. And the second set of targets are now based on what can really be achieved. And therefore, the level of accountability will therefore go up. So I think it's very important.
Is that where, so where companies may have set targets for, we heard today that targets have been in place, one organisation has set targets for 2030, and it's like, actually, the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure isn't there for us to hit our target. So are you talking about that sort of recalibration?
Yeah, so let me give you an example from RAP, the environmental NGO I chair. We have 19 plastic pacts around the world, which is where industry comes together to coalesce around targets. The first one of these was in the UK, and one of the targets there was about the percentage of materials that were recyclable. And that depends on there being infrastructure available to recycle. And so the government effectively was a party to those targets being achieved. Now, for various reasons, COVID and Brexit, and the pace that we expected in 2018 was that there'd be a facility to recycle plastic film by 2023. Well, we've passed that, and it's now going to be 2025-6. So all those companies missed that target because the infrastructure wasn't there. So what's going on there? Does that mean that the companies shouldn't have set targets? Does that mean that the strategy was wrong? I would say no. What it means is that the aspiration was correct. The targets were signed up for in good faith, but actually there has to be now a recalibration which aligns with reality, because CEOs want to hit targets. That's what's really brilliant about CEOs. If you talk about what's the DNA of CEOs, it's that they set targets and hit them, which means they reasonably want to say, well, what do we now know about our likelihood of hitting that target, and how are we going to set a stretching target that we're really going to make?
Okay. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think I'm hearing a lot of organisations that are now not going to hit the targets that they've set, right. And that's globally, isn't it? For absolutely good, solid reasons, you've got targets slipping on one hand, and on the other hand, you've got, more concern around the impact that's happening because we're not really moving forward at the pace that we need to.
Okay. And what's the alternative? The alternative is that nobody sets targets, that people give up. I mean, really, is that what you'd want? So I think it's just pause for reflection when we think about resetting of targets, and particularly in the sense of things that are difficult to be done, and make sure that we don't end up shooting ourselves as society in the foot by making it impossible for companies to set any long-term targets, and that would really be a disaster. Now, whether they have to speak all of them out loud, I think is an interesting conversation. And many CEOs, when you talk to them, they tell you about the public targets, but they will also, in a quiet moment, tell you that they have a couple of other targets that are really important to the board, to the exec team, but they don't talk about out loud, and maybe that's okay.
I think we talked about green hushing in one of the sessions today, which was a term I hadn't heard. I think maybe companies are getting a bit more streetwise about what they're committing to. Is that something you're seeing, perhaps?
Definitely,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the importance is that there's a program, and certainly the work that we do at RAP, is very often about supporting companies in consumer products, in food and drink industry, in textiles and fashion, with action programs. So you can choose to talk about it or not talk about it, but is there an action program? And an action program, less and less, by the way, on what companies can do on their own, and more on when they need to collaborate up and down their supply chain to create a real strategic change to the supply chain.
Okay. What do you think, in terms of the support that CEOs need? If we just reflect back on the stakeholder element that we went through, do you think CEOs do need more support in this environment? Maybe from the board and the conversations it's having. I'm just sort of curious about that pressure that's on CEOs at the moment. Just sort of, or is it the same as it ever was? Maybe it's just a bit faster. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it's not the same as it ever was. I think there's way more moving parts now. It's always been a tough job to be a CEO. And as Seb said, a certain type of person wants to be there. And, when I was a CEO, there was lots going on in the world. But I was a CEO through, also times where, you had to really closely manage all your costs, and you do that anyway as a CEO. But I just think now, there's a lot more complexity for them to manage, and it is really tough. And so from a board's perspective, I think just being there to help support, to recognise that, I always ensure that on my board I've got at least one other person in addition to myself that has been a CEO, so there's that understanding. But I speak to my CEO regularly, and just make sure that they know that I'm there. And I think if we look back last year, as we were doing a lot of the CEO retreats, the big thing that was coming out was burnout. And over again,
100%.
teams were just burnt out at running at pace. And so I often sit there and go, I know historically, you might have thought that, what people are going to say is, well, can't you do more and can't you do it faster? My question to you is, are you doing it too fast? Are you looking after yourself? Have you had a break?
Are you building the team around you?
Are you building the team around so that you can take that and, of course, continue to look at the delivery? That never goes away, does it? Hit the numbers,
Yeah.
Delivery never goes away. I think the other thing, as well as the sort of acceleration that Serena describes, that you really see is the impact of transparency. The kind of radical transparency that we now live in that actually is part of why things seem to have sped up, because things don't bubble. They basically either explode or fizzle out. So the idea of things brewing and building, that certainly was not my experience as a CEO of UK and Ireland. Things basically went bang or nothing happened, and so that kind of transparency, visibility, and the change in kind of porosity between an organization and its customers and stakeholders is a really big change, because it means that CEOs have to be instant communicators, both with the employees of the company, with colleagues, but also with numerous stakeholders externally. And, it's no accident that the sort of communications industry has grown and grown, because actually being able to tell the story in real time has become one of the key qualifications really for CEOs and chairs, particularly chairs of public companies, but not limited to that. And if I reflect on what I do as a chair, and this is partly because it's my background in marketing and communication, but I spend a lot of time communicating in small groups on, and on other media around what the organisation is trying to do and helping that narrative. And I think that's a relatively new thing, but what's really changed is that transparency and the fact that it happens very fast.
Okay. I have to wrap it up there. Thank you, Serena and Seb, for sharing your thoughts on this podcast. Thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this, and we'll have more content for you soon.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for
Thank
listening.
you.